Welcome back. I've been sitting with this script for 3 days now, and the moment I keep returning to is not the mass resignation, not the audit, not the termination. It's the moment Mara sets her pen down in that conference room and then picks it back up and writes nothing but the date. That single, quiet choice. Right here on Historical Manhwa. The announcement came on a Tuesday, which should have been my first sign. Promotions at Wyndham Retail Group happened on Mondays. Everyone in the company knew that. Mondays were for good news. Tuesdays were for the kind of good news that needed the week to absorb the damage. I was standing in the corridor outside conference room 14C when I heard the particular quality of silence that precedes something. The way a room stops generating its own ambient sound just before everyone inside it adjusts their expression. I straightened my jacket. I pushed open the door. The room smelled like stale coffee and the faint chemical edge of a dry erase marker left uncapped overnight. It was a smell I associated with decisions, with the moments that pivoted on themselves and became the before and after of a working life. I had sat in this room through a lot of those moments. I would not sit in it for many more. 11 of us took our seats. District managers, area supervisors, one compliance coordinator who had been included by administrative error and would spend the entire meeting in a state of visible confusion. Dorian stood at the head of the room with the posture of a man who had rehearsed his own face in a bathroom mirror. He had a way of building anticipation that he believed was elegant, and that was actually just slow. I had known, approximately 3 weeks before, that Tuesday, that I was not getting the promotion. I had known it the way, a diagnosis before the doctor says the word, from the accumulation of small signals, each one individually dismissible, that together form a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. All of the way Dorian had stopped CCing me on certain regional planning threads, the way Isolde had started appearing in calendar invitations for conversations about strategic direction that previously would have included me. The way Dorian's admin had booked a department meeting for a Tuesday with unusual urgency and minimal agenda detail. I had spent those 3 weeks deciding what to do about what I knew. Not in a panicked way, in a considered way. I am a person who makes decisions by sitting with the facts until they arrange themselves into something clear. And by the time I walked into conference room 14C that morning, I had arranged these facts into something clear enough to act on. "I want to be the first to congratulate our new regional manager," he said. He paused, the kind of pause you deploy when you are enjoying yourself. "Isolde Carver." The room produced a sound, not applause exactly, something more like the collective noise of 11 people deciding in real time what their faces should be doing. I was sitting 3 seats to Dorian's left. I had a pen in my hand. I set it down on the notepad in front of me. I looked at the notepad for one moment, which was the moment I allowed myself. Then I looked back up at the front of the room. Isolde was at the far end of the table. She smiled the way people smile when they have waited for their name to be called for a very long time. Her hair was the precise blonde that requires monthly maintenance. She wore a blazer with the sleeves pushed up, which was the aesthetic signature of someone who wanted to signal operational engagement without having demonstrably earned it. I picked up my pen, but I wrote the date at the top of my notepad, just the date. Nothing else. I had been managing 12 stores across Wyndham's Northern District for 4 years. I want to explain what that meant because it matters to the rest of this story. I had started as a store manager at the Kelmore Street flagship, which was underperforming when I took it over. Not dramatically. It wasn't a disaster, just a slow bleed. The kind of store that is technically open and functional, but has lost the thread of why. The staff were competent and exhausted. The inventory system had a reconciliation error that no one had traced back to its source, and everyone had learned to work around instead. The visual merchandising had not been updated in 2 years because the budget kept getting redirected, and no one had fought for it. Because I spent the first 3 months doing nothing except watching. Not with a clipboard, just watching, where customers paused, where they turned around, where the floor got congested in the afternoon. I watched the staff, who was good at what, who needed what kind of support, who was quietly managing other people's errors in addition to their own workload without any acknowledgement of it. In month 4, I made 8 changes. All of them were structural. None of them were decorative. The store turned profitable in month 8. I was given a second location. Then 3 more. By the time I was named district manager, I had 12 stores across 2 counties. Every one of them was meeting or exceeding its quarterly targets. The one exception was a marginal location in a struggling shopping center that had been struggling before I arrived and that I had brought from a net drag to a break-even, which I considered the realistic ceiling for that specific geography. I knew those 12 stores the way you know the floor plan of a house you have lived in for years. Not because I was exceptional at memorizing floor plans, because I had spent 4 years showing up, asking questions, and caring about the answers. The person I thought about most in those first days after the announcement was a store manager named Petra. She ran the Thornfield location, which was a Category B store in a mixed-use development that had gone through 2 ownership changes in 5 years and had never quite stabilized its foot traffic. Petra had been managing it for 18 months and had brought it from inconsistent to reliable through a combination of hyperlocal marketing that she had invented herself, a vendor relationship she had cultivated with a regional food and gift supplier whose products drove weekend traffic, and a staffing schedule that was precisely, inventively calibrated to the rhythms of that specific location in a way that no one outside the store fully understood. I had tried, once, to formalize Petra's approach in a district memo I could share with other managers. She had sat across from me at a small table in the Thornfield back office, patient and slightly amused, and explained that what she did was not formalizable. "I know these people," she said. The ones who come on Saturday mornings with their kids are different from the ones who come on Tuesday afternoons. Different products, different pace, different what they need from us. The schedule exists for them. I can't write that down. I hadn't tried to formalize it again. I had simply let her manage. Isolde had not visited the Thornfield location yet. It was not visually striking enough to make her first list. Isolde had managed one store for 11 months, before Dorian installed her in a regional coordinator role that appeared to exist primarily so that she could attend meetings and be visible to the right people. The role had no clear deliverables that I had ever been able to identify. When I had asked Dorian once, obliquely, about the scope of the regional coordinator function, he had said something about brand ambassadorship and moved on to the next item on the agenda. I had filed that away. After the announcement, people filtered out of the conference room in the way that people filter out of a space where something uncomfortable has just occurred, with great efficiency and minimal eye contact. I walked back to the workspace on the 12th floor that had become, by long-established informal consensus, mine. I sat down. I looked at the window, which faced the parking structure and offered no useful view. Then I began to think, not about how unfair it was. I understood how unfair it was. I did not need time to process that dimension of it. I needed to think about what I actually knew and what knowing it meant. What I knew? 12 stores, 11 of which were meeting or exceeding targets. Damn it, what I knew? Dorian had been positioning Isolde for the better part of a year. I had noted it in small, accumulating ways. The CC on emails that her function did not require. The way Dorian introduced her at the Regional Leadership Summit as someone with a real instinct for the floor, which was a phrase composed entirely of air, but which landed in rooms as if it carried weight. The way he asked her opinion in meetings on operational questions, while I was also in the room, with a specific quality of attention that was not about the answer. What I knew, Dorian was not the fulcrum I needed to apply pressure to. Above Dorian was a woman named Patricia, the VP of Operations for the Eastern region, who sat in corporate headquarters and who I had met twice in 4 years. And she was the kind of executive who moved quickly and did not get attached to individual personnel, which made her dangerous in some contexts and potentially useful in others. What I knew, a formal HR complaint about the promotion decision would take months and would position me as a disruption and would almost certainly result in nothing, because the decision had been made by someone with the authority to make it, and the formal process was not designed to undo that kind of decision. What I knew, I had 4 years of institutional knowledge about this district that existed in 2 places. Some of it was in Wyndham systems, the rest of it was in my head and in my personal files. And the second category was, if I was being precise about it, the more valuable of the 2. I opened a new document on my computer. I titled it District Operational Reference, Northern Region, and I started writing. The thing about a retail district is that it has 2 structures running simultaneously. There is the official structure. The org chart, the reporting lines, the handbook policies, the vendor directory, the compliance appendix, all of it documented, filed, accessible to anyone with the right system permissions. And then there is the real structure, which is built out of years of workarounds and relationships and the specific accumulated memory of people who have been doing the same job in the same building for a very long time and who have learned, through experience, which of the official rules are load-bearing and which ones were written by someone who had never set foot in a store. The real structure is the knowledge that the HVAC unit at the Parlow Street location breaks down every January without fail, and that there is a specific technician named Ray who does not appear anywhere in the official vendor directory, but whose number is in the personal phones of 3 long-tenured employees, and who can be on site within 4 hours and will charge fairly and not overstate the diagnosis. The real structure is the knowledge that Wyndham's inventory system has a reconciliation error in the Week 4 quarterly report that generates a phantom discrepancy every single cycle, and that the correct response is a manual override, not an audit trigger, and that 3 of my store managers had learned this through painful experience, and the other 9 had learned it through me. The real structure is the arrangement that Gideon, who ran the Kelmore Street store after I moved on from it, and who had been there for 11 years, had with the building management regarding the service entrance and delivery windows. The arrangement technically violated the lease language in one specific clause that no one on either side had ever wanted to invoke. The arrangement worked. Everyone understood this, implicitly, and proceeded accordingly, and the deliveries happened on time and the store ran smoothly. The day someone who didn't know about the arrangement sent a by-the-book email to the building management demanding they comply with the technical lease terms was the day that arrangement collapsed, and Gideon spent a month managing a delivery schedule that added 6 hours of labor per week for no benefit to anyone. And none of this was in any official document. All of it was in my head. I spent 3 evenings that week putting it into the document I had started. Not as a transition document for Isolda, not as a parting gift to Wyndham. I wrote it down because I needed to understand exactly what I had, to inventory my own knowledge, to see it laid out, to understand precisely what I was sitting on and what I would be walking away from. I was already thinking about walking away, not in a reactive, heat-of-the-moment way, in a considered way. The way you think about an exit when you have already accepted that you're leaving and you are just waiting to understand the best route out. Isolda's shadowing period began the following Monday. She arrived at the Dunmore Street location, my best performing store, managed by a woman named Elena, wearing the same blazer, sleeves pushed up, carrying a leather notebook that was expensive and visibly untouched. The store smelled like it's morning, fresh cardboard and packing material from the overnight deliveries, the sharp industrial cleaner the floor team used before opening, the faint warm plastic edge of the new display fixtures that had gone in the previous week. Elena met us at the door. She was 29, had been managing Dunmore for 3 years, and knew more about retail operations than most people twice her age. She extended her hand to Isolda, took her through the floor, answered questions. I walked one step behind and watched where Isolda's eyes went. They went to the displays, the lighting, the signage, the way the fixtures were arranged to create sightlines to the back of the store. Her notes, when she wrote them, were notes about aesthetics. Her eyes did not go to the stockroom. They did not go to the scheduling board on the back wall of the manager's office, which Elena used as her primary labor management tool and which I had always considered the true dashboard of a store's health. They did not go to the POS terminal reports, which were posted in a small binder next to the register each morning and which told you, in specific numerical terms, how the store was actually doing. Afterward, in the parking lot, while the November air moved cold across the asphalt, Isolda turned to me. "Elena's remarkable," she said. "The energy in that store, you can just feel it." "She runs the highest margin location in the district," I said. Isolde smiled warmly. "That tracks. Culture always drives numbers eventually." I looked at her for a moment. She believed this. That was the notable thing. She was not being deliberately vague or deliberately evasive. She genuinely believed it. "Sure," I said. I got in my car and drove to the next location. I shadowed Isolde through her full 2-week period. It would be more accurate to say she shadowed me, since I was still the operational point of contact and she was the observer, but the org chart was already repositioned and we both understood that. By the end of it, I had a clear picture of what Isolde understood and what she did not. She understood visual retail. She had a genuine eye for it, a real instinct for what a store looked like and how presentation affected the initial customer experience. That was real skill. In a purely brand-focused role, she would have been good. The problem was that this was not a purely brand-focused role. This was a regional management role for a 12-store district with a Q4 audit coming in 6 weeks and a labor market that was tightening, and a compliance appendix that had several sections with meaningful teeth. The other problem, the more dangerous one, was that Isolde did not know what she didn't know. This was a specific kind of danger. People who know nothing about a job at least know they need to ask questions. People who know a confident portion of a job, the visible, legible, aesthetically apparent portion, move with a certainty that does not pause to check the things it cannot see. I had watched this failure mode play out once before, at a company I worked for early in my career. A regional manager who focused intensely on store presentation and made sweeping staffing cuts to fund a renovation program, and who had 12 months later presided over the closure of 3 locations and the public evisceration of his own professional reputation. He was not a stupid man. He just couldn't see the 80%. I wrote this down in the operational document that night. Not the story, the mechanism, the exact sequence. What to watch for, and when. Then I opened a separate window, and I wrote a short professional email to a man named Adrian. Adrian worked for Aldercroft Group, which operated a competing retail chain across the same regional geography. We had met at an industry conference 2 years earlier and maintained the loose professional connection that people in the same sector often do. An occasional message, it's a brief exchange at a trade event, the kind of low-maintenance relationship that can remain dormant for months and then be revived without awkwardness. He had reached out twice in the past year to ask whether I had any interest in discussing an opportunity at Aldercroft. I had said no both times. I was still building something at Wyndham, and you do not leave a thing you're building until you are certain it will not continue without you, or until you have been told, in the clearest possible terms, that it is not yours to build. I had now been told, in the clearest possible terms. My email to Adrian was 6 sentences. I referenced our previous conversations, said that I had some flexibility in the near term, suggested we reconnect if the timing still worked on his side. I did not explain anything. I did not reference the promotion or Isolde or any specific circumstance. None of that was his to carry. He replied the following morning. He was free for lunch the following Tuesday. I confirmed the time and went back to the operational document. There is a section of the Wyndham Employee Handbook, page 47 in the Compliance Appendix, that most people in the company had never read. It addressed staffing minimums by store category. Category A stores, defined as flagship and high-traffic locations, were required to maintain a minimum floor staff ratio of 1 associate per 600 square feet during peak hours. Category B stores, 1 per 800. The section was not framed as a guideline. It was framed as a compliance requirement. The rationale behind it was not customer service optics. The rationale was loss prevention. The calculation had been made by Wyndham's risk management division based on 5 years of shrinkage data, and the conclusion was that stores below those minimums showed a measurable and consistent increase in inventory loss during peak periods. I had found this section 3 years earlier when I was tracing a persistent inventory discrepancy at one of my stores back to its source. The discrepancy wasn't related to the staffing section, but I had read the whole appendix because that is how I approach problems. Start at the beginning, read everything, and decide later what is and is not relevant. All 12 of my stores had always operated above the minimums. This was not because I had been diligent about the compliance requirements specifically. It was because I staffed according to operational need, and an operational need in a well-run store naturally puts you above the minimum. But I knew the section was there. I knew where it was and what it said and why it existed. I had a feeling, sitting in the 12th floor office in late October, that it was about to become important. Isolde became official regional manager on the 1st of November. There was an email from Dorian's office, a brief departmental lunch that I attended and contributed minimally to. A new org chart circulated to the district in which Isolde's name occupied a position that had not previously existed in any configuration that included mine. The first thing she did in her new role was schedule a district-wide meeting. The 12 store managers gathered in conference room 14C. Isolde stood at the head of the table. I sat at the back, which was a new positional relationship with that room, and I sat in it without adjusting my face. Isolde's presentation was about brand alignment. The slides were genuinely beautiful. She had produced them herself or commissioned someone good, and they were polished and coherent and communicated a clear visual vision for what Wyndham's Northern District stores should look and feel like. She used images of aspirational competitor chains, photographs of carefully staged store environments, a vocabulary of words like warmth and discovery and intention that were evocative without being operational. She spoke for 40 minutes about the importance of visual consistency, about the customer experience, about what she called the feel of a Wyndham store. She did not once mention labor, did not mention inventory, did not mention the Q4 audit that was 6 weeks out, did not mention any of the tracked metrics that determined whether a location was profitable. I watched the room while she spoke. The managers were polite. They took notes. They asked reasonable questions about display standards and rollout timelines. A few of them glanced at me briefly, with the careful eyes of people who were filing something away for later. Gideon was sitting 2 seats to my right. He was a compact, methodical man who had been managing the Kelmore Street store for 11 years, and who had the slightly tired, extremely reliable quality of someone who had seen most possible retail situations and had developed considered opinions about all of them. He had a way of going very still when he was processing something that contradicted his understanding of how things should work. He was very still now. Near the end of the meeting, he angled his notepad slightly toward me. I glanced down. In the margin, he had written, "Does she know we have a Q4 audit in 6 weeks?" I did not react. Afterward, we ended up in the kitchen at the same time. He poured coffee. He did not look directly at me, which was a conversational style I had come to understand as consideration rather than avoidance. "So," he said. "So?" I said. "The Visual Standards Initiative, that's going to require staff time and budget." "It will, yes." "We're entering Q4. We have an audit coming." He wrapped both hands around his mug in a way that suggested he was measuring his words carefully. "If we redirect staff time to a visual overhaul right now, the audit prep suffers. We can't do both at the same staffing levels." "That's a reasonable operational concern," I said. He gave me a look that had some precision in it. "Are you going to raise it with her, the audit timing?" I said. "I'm sure the audit is on the district calendar." A pause. "Is it?" I looked at him. "It should be." He gave me another look, this one longer and flatter. He understood me perfectly. He set his mug down and left the kitchen without further comment. I met Adrian for lunch on a Tuesday at a restaurant near the Kelmore Street store. White tablecloths, no music, the kind of place where you can have a real conversation without performing it. The food was not the point. The air was not the point. The point was an hour of candid professional discussion between two people who had no reason to be anything but direct with each other. He was the kind of person who was easy to underestimate because his default register was calm and he listened more than he spoke. And some people read sustained listening as passivity. I had understood within 20 minutes of meeting him 2 years ago that he was not passive. He was precise. He formed opinions slowly and held them with conviction, and the two things were connected. We talked about the industry for 20 minutes before either of us mentioned anything personal or specific to our own situations. It was a real conversation, the kind that people who actually work in retail have when they are not performing expertise for an audience, about inventory system limitations and labor market dynamics and the ways consumer foot traffic had redistributed in the past 3 years, and what it meant for location strategy. After a while, he set his fork down. "What changed?" he said. "Some structural things shifted in my district. I'm thinking about the long view." He nodded. He already knew something specific had shifted. He was in the same industry, and he read subtext with the efficiency of someone who had been in professional rooms for a long time. But he did not push. "We have a regional director position coming open in Q1, he said, "covering 12 to 15 locations across 2 counties. You'd be building the operational infrastructure largely from scratch. As the territory is healthy but under-optimized." "What's the timeline?" "Flexible. We'd ideally want someone in place by March, a soft start in January, some overlap with the current structure before it fully turns over would be ideal. I thought about January. It was October. I had time to be careful. I'd want to see the full scope, I said. The financial targets, the staffing model, the compliance framework as it currently stands. Of course. He reached into his jacket and produced a card. Not his own card, a card with a different name, a legal firm. Our HR attorney handles the initial discussion under NDA, nothing binding, just so both parties can be fully transparent. I took the card. I put it in my bag. One question, I said. He waited. The regional director position? Does it require inheriting an existing management team, or does it allow for building one? He smiled, just slightly. It was the smile of someone who recognized a specific kind of question. We want someone who can attract talent, someone people trust. I picked up my water. That's useful to know. November brought Isolde's first move on staffing. She sent a memo to the district. She had been reviewing payroll reports, she said, and had identified several locations running above Wyndham's standard cost per labor hour ratio. She was proposing a 10% reduction in scheduled hours across 4 stores she had flagged as over ratio, effective immediately, to bring Q4 labor costs in line with corporate targets before end of year. Petra called me 2 days after the memo went out. It was a Sunday afternoon. She called from the floor, which I could tell from the ambient sound. I used the faint register of her store's weekend music and the low-level movement of customers. I got the memo, she said. I know. Thornfield isn't on her list. You're a Category B, I said. Your ratios look different on paper. They look different because the schedule I run is not standard. It's calibrated to this location. If she ever actually looks at it, she'll flag it. A pause, and I could hear her moving away from the floor into somewhere quieter. Mara, she's going to look at it eventually. Probably. When she does, she's going to see staffing on Saturday mornings that looks heavy by any standard metric. She won't know that Saturday morning is when we do 60% of our weekly revenue in a 4-hour window because of the food and gift vendor arrangement. Have you documented the vendor arrangement formally? A pause. Oh, the arrangement is a handshake. It's been a handshake for 18 months. Document it, I said, formally in writing through the vendor management system this week. Is that urgent? It will be more urgent in 6 weeks, I said. Do it now while it's quiet. She heard what I meant. All right, she said. And the Saturday staffing? Build a case for it, revenue data by time of day by day of week. If the schedule reflects a real operational need, the data will show that. She was quiet for a moment. Are you leaving? I said what I had started saying to everyone who asked. I'm evaluating things. She absorbed this without pushing. I'll document the vendor arrangement, she said, and I'll build the case. She did both. I know because she sent me the documentation when she was done, which she was not required to do, and which she did because she was the kind of professional who understood that a record is most useful when more than one person holds it. I saved her emails in the November folder. The memo was not invented. She had read real data. The stores she identified were in fact running at higher labor cost ratios than the corporate average. She had done that part of the analysis correctly. The problem was that she had read that data in isolation. She had not read the data on why those stores were running above ratio, which was a different and more important question. 3 of the 4 stores she had identified were Category A flagship locations with above-average foot traffic and high transaction volumes. Their labor ratios were higher because their operational load was higher and the cost was proportional to actual need. She also had not read page 47. I read the memo once, at my desk, and then I sat for approximately 30 seconds and thought about what to do. I had options. I could raise the concern loudly, in a meeting or a group email, in a way that positioned me as the person who was protecting the district from poor leadership. That would feel satisfying for a short time and would accomplish nothing except to make Isolde defensive and give Dorian a reason to characterize me as obstructionist. Or I could do something quiet and documentable and correct. I pulled up the compliance appendix. I went to page 47. I read the relevant sections again, carefully, to make sure I had it exactly right. Then I opened a new email. I wrote to Isolde directly. I told her I wanted to flag a potential compliance issue with the staffing proposal before it was implemented. I cited pages 47 through 49 of the compliance appendix. I explained that the proposed reductions would bring 3 Category A locations below the minimum floor staff ratio during peak periods, and that the 4th store would be borderline in violation during holiday traffic windows. I attached a brief table I had built from the compliance policy and each store's square footage and the peak hour calculations. I told her I was raising it early, so she had time to review before the schedule changes were finalized. I copied no one. I sent it only to her. The response came 4 hours later. Thanks for flagging this. I'll review and circle back. She did not circle back. All the schedule changes went out to the 4 stores 3 days later, unchanged. I saved her email. I saved mine. I saved the timestamp on both. I saved the schedule distribution documentation. Then I moved everything, my memo, her reply, the schedule documents, the relevant pages from the compliance appendix, into a folder in my personal cloud storage that I had created the week after the announcement. I labeled it November. The thing about a compliance violation in a retail environment is that it doesn't just violate a policy. It initiates a chain of effects that people who have never managed a floor don't fully understand, and that people who have managed floors understand without being told. Effect 1: shrinkage increases. Loss prevention capacity drops directly with floor coverage. Wyndham's own risk management had documented this relationship over 5 years, which is why the policy existed. When you cut coverage below the minimum, inventory loss rises within 4 to 6 weeks. It is not a theory. It is a measured, documented, predictable outcome. Effect 2: customer satisfaction declines. This shows up more slowly in the satisfaction scores that get compiled monthly and reported quarterly. It's a lagging indicator, but it is reliable, and it arrives. And when it does, it carries a specific kind of institutional weight, because it is objective and numerical and very hard to explain away. Effect 3: the existing staff begin to absorb the missing hours. They cover the coverage gap. They run harder and faster, and for longer periods without relief. This does not show up in the payroll data as a problem. It shows up in human beings over a period of weeks as a quiet, accumulating decision to update their resumes. I knew all of this because I had studied it, and because I had watched it happen at another company a long time ago. The information was not secret. It was not proprietary. It existed in management research and in industry data, and in the compliance appendix on page 47. The question was never whether the information existed. The question was who cared enough to find it. I signed the NDA with Aldercroft's attorney in the 2nd week of November. It was a standard document. Both parties agreed that discussions about a potential role were confidential and constituted neither an offer nor an acceptance. I read it 3 times before signing it, which the attorney observed with what might have been measured approval. Over the following 2 weeks, Adrian and I had 3 calls and 1 more lunch. He walked me through the Aldercroft regional model in detail. Their territory structure, their financial targets, their reporting lines, their compliance framework, which was more comprehensive in certain areas and had meaningful gaps in others. Gaps that I noted and did not comment on yet, because commenting on them before I had agreed to anything would have been a form of free consulting. I told him what I would need from the role. Clear authority over hiring at the store management level. This was non-negotiable, because the specific lesson of the past 4 years was that trust at the management level could not be inherited. It had to be built, and it could only be built if you had the authority to choose who you were building with. A defined compliance framework that I would have input on drafting, and a transition period of at least 6 weeks where I would overlap with their existing structure before fully taking over. Because taking over a region cold was how you missed the things that only revealed themselves over time. Adrian agreed to all 3 without negotiation, which told me either that he trusted my judgment or that he was desperate enough to give me what I asked for. I thought it was the former. I have always preferred to think the best of the people I choose to work with. The evidence usually supports it or it doesn't, and you find out soon enough either way. I did not tell him about the November folder. I did not tell him about Isolda, or about Dorian's specific failure of judgment. Those were my circumstances to manage, not his. The conversation between us was about what I could build, not about what I was leaving behind. The Q4 audit was scheduled for mid-January. Most of the store managers in the district were aware of it, because I had made sure they were aware of it. Calendar awareness was part of how I managed a district. I made certain that every manager knew, 3 months out, what the significant compliance events in their near future were. Not because I didn't trust them to track their own calendars, but because the district ran better when everyone's timeline was synchronized. One of the things that had not been communicated to Isolde, not by me, not by Dorian, apparently, and not by the administrative staff, was when precisely the Q4 audit was scheduled, or if it had been communicated, it had not registered. I had watched her calendar and her meeting schedule and her email outputs for the 3 weeks since she had taken over, and there was no indication that she was building toward it. There was instead a growing set of emails about the visual standards rollout, timeline charts, approval requests for display materials, a budget allocation proposal for new signage that she sent to Dorian on a Friday afternoon in the middle of November, and that he approved by Monday morning. I read these outputs the way you read a weather system, looking for what they told you about the direction of travel and the speed, not just the current conditions. The direction was clear, the speed was concerning. Gideon called me on a Wednesday evening in the last week of November. He had a specific quality when he called in the evening, which was that he called only when something had crossed a threshold he had set for himself and needed to be said out loud to someone whose judgment he trusted. He did not call to vent. He called to report. "The new schedule has been running for 3 weeks," he said. "I'm down 2 floor associates during peak periods. I filed an internal incident report this morning about a shoplifting event I believe would not have escalated to a merchandise theft if I had proper coverage. The report received an automated acknowledgement." "I'm sorry about the incident," I said. "I've been compliant with that staffing section my entire career. 11 years. I have never been out of compliance." "I know." "I pulled up page 47. He said. "I showed it to my assistant manager this morning. She had never read it either." "Most people haven't." A pause. "Mara, we are out of compliance. We have been for 3 weeks, through the beginning of the holiday season." "I know," I said. "Did you raise this with Isolde?" "I sent her a written notification before the schedules were finalized, with the specific sections cited and the calculations attached." A longer pause. Something shifted in the texture of the silence. "And she implemented the schedules anyway?" "Yes." I heard him exhale. It was the exhale of a person recalibrating his understanding of his own situation. "The Q4 audit," he said. "January. The November shrinkage data will be in the report." "It will be in the report," I said. A silence. "Is there a formal channel for this? Is a way to raise a compliance concern that goes above regional management?" I had been waiting for this question, not in an anticipatory way, not hoping for it, just aware that it was likely to come, given who Gideon was and how he operated. "There's a Wyndham Ethics hotline," I said. "It's separate from the normal HR reporting channel. Complaints filed through it go directly to the corporate compliance team, not to regional or district management." "Does it protect me from retaliation?" "There's a written non-retaliation policy associated with it." A pause. He was weighing this. "Does it work? In practice?" I chose my words carefully. "The documentation of a compliance concern through that channel creates a time-stamped record that exists independent of the normal reporting hierarchy. And what you do with that information is your decision." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. And then, "Mara, are you staying?" I looked at the wall of my apartment, at the operational document open on my laptop, at the folder labeled November. "I'm evaluating things," I said. "Right." Another pause, shorter. "I'll file the concern." December arrived the way Q4 always arrives in retail. Suddenly and completely, without negotiation. The holiday season is when a district reveals everything that has been quietly wrong since the summer. There is no time to paper over anything. Every structural problem you have been managing quietly becomes unmanageable at volume. At Wyndham's Northern District, the problems began to surface in the first week. I was still technically a district support resource through the end of my notice period. Though support had become a functionally ambiguous term, I was present, I was available, I was watching. On December 4th, I visited the Parlow Street location on a Saturday afternoon. I had gone without a scheduled reason. Old habit, the kind of visit I had always done, just dropping in at an unannounced time to see what a store looked like when it wasn't expecting me. The store manager, Ferris, was on the floor himself, which was unusual for a manager on a Saturday afternoon. It meant his coverage was thin enough that he could not afford to be off it. The store was doing well in terms of traffic. People were moving through it. The holiday display Isolde had rolled out looked good. Genuinely, she had an eye, and the festive visual arrangement was warm and inviting and would read well in any brand evaluation. Whilst the problem was the checkout line. It was 8 people long and moving slowly because there were 2 registers staffed. Parlow Street, at Category A designation and its specific square footage, required 5 floor associates during peak hours under the compliance policy. On that Saturday afternoon, I counted 3. Ferris caught my eye from across the store. His expression had the quality of someone managing a controlled emergency. I gave him a small nod and left without speaking to him. He had enough to manage. He did not need me to make it worse by being visible. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes, not out of hesitation, just to let the picture fully develop. The checkout line that was 8 people long, the 2 registers, the 3 floor associates covering a space that needed 5. Sounds the holiday displays that looked beautiful. Then I drove to my next stop. Ferris called me the following Tuesday. He was the Parlow Street manager, not someone who called unless the threshold was real. He had been with Wyndham for 8 years, had managed Parlow Street for 3, and had a quality of stoic operational focus that meant when he finally called to say something was wrong, something was genuinely and substantially wrong. "I had a customer incident Saturday," he said. "A family dispute at the register, which escalated, raised voices, a cart that got knocked over. My floor team was running too thin to de-escalate it before it got big enough that I had to come off the floor myself. Anyone hurt? No, but it was a near thing with the cart." A pause. "I'm filing an incident report. I want it documented that this occurred under current staffing levels." "That's the right call," I said. "I'm also writing a cover note explaining the context. The specific coverage numbers, the compliance minimum, the gap." He was quiet for a moment. "I've already pulled the compliance section. I know about page 47. "Good. "I have a question," he said. "A direct one." "Go ahead." "You flagged this to Isolde in writing in November." "I did." "And she moved forward anyway?" "Yes." I heard him breathe. "I've been in this company for 8 years, he said. "I have never had a customer incident that I would attribute directly to staffing. I have never been in compliance violation. Not once." A pause. "I don't intend to be in violation because someone wanted a favorable labor cost number in Q4. I did not say anything to that. Mog, there was nothing I needed to say. "Is there anything else I should be documenting?" he asked. "Document everything," I said. "Dates, conversations, incidents, your attempts to escalate. A precise and complete record is the most useful thing you can have right now." He said he would. He did. His ethics complaint to corporate, filed that Thursday, was the second one in the system. Gideon's had been the first. A third would follow from a manager in a different part of the district later that month. Elena called me on a Thursday morning. Her store, the Dunmore Street location, was running 30% above the previous year's Q4 traffic, which was good and which she had prepared for, but she was doing it with a reduced floor team because the scheduling change had taken 2 associates off her peak period coverage. All 3 of her staff had given notice in the past 2 weeks. All 3 were leaving for positions elsewhere. All 3 exit surveys cited the scheduling changes and reduced hours. "Do you know what the replacement timeline looks like?" I asked. 3 to 4 weeks minimum if I start recruiting today. Holiday hiring is over. I'm not going to find anyone with floor experience before January. "Have you documented this for Isolde?" I sent her an email this morning. I laid out the coverage gap, the Q4 traffic projections, the impact on service quality, and potentially on shrinkage. "Keep the documentation," I said. A pause. "Mara." "Yes." "Are you leaving Wyndham?" I was quiet for a moment. "I'm not in a position to discuss that yet." She absorbed this. "Okay, I respect that." Another pause. "Mike, I want you to know that regardless of what happens, The last 3 years working in this district have been the best 3 years of my career. And that's operational truth, not sentiment. I know the difference, I said. And I want to say something clearly. I think you are ready for a district role. I've thought that for a while. I want you to know that I believe that regardless of what happens and regardless of who is doing the advocating. She was quiet for a moment. That's either very reassuring or extremely ominous. Probably both, to some extent. She laughed, just slightly. All right, I'll keep the documentation. I want to be precise about what I was doing in those weeks, because the distinction matters. I was not coordinating a departure, and I was not telling people to file complaints, or to update their resumes, or to make any particular decision. I was not organizing anything. What I was doing was maintaining the relationships I had built over 4 years with 12 professionals I respected, providing accurate information about formal channels and policies when they asked for it directly, being honest when directly asked about my own situation and my own assessment of the district, and when specific individuals asked whether there might be opportunities available elsewhere, not pretending I didn't know the answer. That is a different thing from orchestration. I am careful about this distinction because it matters professionally and because it accurately describes what actually happened. I also knew, because I had spent 4 years paying careful, a genuine attention to these specific people, what each of them was built for, what they would and would not tolerate, and how close or far each one was from the edge of their patience. I knew this the way you know the load-bearing walls of a building after enough time in it. Not because I had mapped it strategically, because I had cared about them and paid attention and been present over a long time, and paying attention to people you care about produces knowledge about them that is as precise as any formal assessment. I was not pulling triggers. I was simply aware that they existed, and that several of them were already being pulled by the situation itself, without my involvement. Isolde called me in the second week of December. Not by email, by phone. I was in my car outside the Fenwick location on a Tuesday afternoon when her name appeared on my screen, which was unusual enough that I noted it specifically. Her voice had a particular controlled quality that I associated with people who were managing more than they were showing. I've been seeing some exit surveys, she said. Several of them are referencing the scheduling changes. I wanted to check in about the turnover picture. It's Q4, I said. There's always movement. Elena's lost 3 people. Gideon filed something. I got a forwarded note from compliance, and I'm hearing that other managers may be looking. The exit surveys are accurate, I said. The scheduling reduction affected both morale and coverage. I hear that, she said. We had a cost target. You may hit the Q4 labor cost target, I said. Oh, I'd watch the shrinkage data and the satisfaction scores when they compile. A pause. You think there's a problem? I think there are some indicators worth monitoring closely. A longer pause. You flagged the compliance issue in November. I did. I should have looked at that more carefully. I said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Is there anything I should be doing right now? She asked. I thought about the specific answer to that question. There were at least 7 things she should be addressing immediately. The staffing compliance, the shrinkage trajectory, the audit 6 weeks out, Elena's recruiting gap, Gideon's coverage, the 3 ethics filings now in the system, and the fact that at least 2 other store managers, I knew this from recent conversations, had already begun quietly looking elsewhere. Oh, the compliance issue on staffing is the most time-sensitive, I said. The audit will look at November payroll against the Category A requirements, and the documentation that exists in that chain is specific. I'll get back to you, she said. She did not get back to me. There are 2 kinds of silence in a professional situation. There is the silence of someone who has heard a problem, processed it, and made a deliberate decision about how to respond. And there is the silence of someone who is hoping that a problem, if not looked at directly, will quietly resolve itself. The second kind of silence has a specific accompanying behavior, a series of small positive actions in a different area entirely, which create the feeling of forward momentum and which prevent you from having to sit in the stillness of the real problem. Isolde sent a cheerful district-wide email in the 3rd week of December about the visual standards progress. She noted positive feedback from a mystery shopper evaluation. She shared photographs of 2 stores that had completed the new display configuration. She used the phrase, "This is what the Wyndham brand should feel like." The email had the quality of someone who was very actively rearranging furniture in a specific room, while in an adjacent room, something was quietly and persistently catching fire. I read it once and filed it. Then I opened my calendar and I set a date. December 22nd. I gave my notice on December 22nd. I had chosen that date deliberately. The 2 weeks between Christmas and the New Year are the quietest administrative period in any corporate calendar. End-of-year processes are in close mode. Staff are on partial schedules. The institutional machinery that processes departures, the paperwork, the knowledge transfer requests, the exit interviews, the announcements, runs at reduced speed during this window. I wanted maximum time and minimum noise. I called Dorian in the morning. He took it with a quality of genuine surprise that I found interesting. I think he had believed I would absorb the promotion decision and continue, that I was the kind of person who accommodated herself to the available structure and kept building within it, because that was what I had always done. He was not wrong that I had always done that. He was wrong about why. I had always accommodated myself to the available structure because the available structure had always been one that let me do good work. He used the moment it stopped being that was the moment accommodation stopped being an option I was interested in. He asked if there was anything that would change my mind. I said no. He asked where I was going. I said I wasn't in a position to discuss that. He said after a pause that my contributions to the district had been significant and that he was sorry to see me go. He meant it. I heard the sincerity in it. It did not change anything, because sincerity and good judgment are different qualities, and his failure had been in the second one. My official last day would be January 5th. I spent the remainder of December completing a thorough, professionally produced transition document for the district. Everything Wyndham would need, the operational processes, the key vendor contacts, the compliance calendar, and the store-specific notes that were appropriate to hand over. I left nothing out that was legitimately theirs. I was complete and careful, and I did not editorialize. The things that were not appropriately Wyndham's to keep, the institutional relationships, the specific knowledge of 12 people and what they needed and how they thought and what they were worth and what they would not accept, those traveled with me in the way that all genuine human knowledge travels, in the person who built it. I started at Aldercroft on January 8th, a Wednesday. No announcement. Adrian had asked whether I wanted any public visibility around the move, and I had said no, not yet. I wanted the first 3 weeks to be quiet, to understand the new structure properly before I said anything to anyone in the industry about where I was. But Aldercroft's regional infrastructure was a different kind of project from Wyndham's. Not broken, functional, but under-optimized in specific, correctable ways that I could see within the first week. Their compliance framework was half-built. Their labor scheduling was done manually on spreadsheets that were theoretically synced across stores and actually lagged by anywhere from 3 days to a week. Their vendor directory was current, which was a relief. Their store management team was a mixed picture. Some very capable people, some significant gaps, one location that had been operating without a permanent manager for 6 months, and running on a rotating interim system that was generating measurable inconsistency in its numbers. These were problems I knew how to solve. This was work. In my first week, I spent 2 days simply reading every operational document, every compliance record, every performance report I could access. I was looking for the architecture of the place. What existed formally and what existed only informally, what was load-bearing and what was decorative, what the actual people in these stores knew that the documents didn't say. On day 6, I scheduled a call with the Aldercroft compliance officer, a careful, thorough man named Leopold, who had been in the role for 4 years, and who, I gathered immediately, had been trying to build out the compliance framework without the organizational authority to make it stick. He had a draft staffing minimum policy that had been sitting in review for 7 months. Who has to approve it? I asked. Regional leadership needs to sign off. I'm regional leadership now, I said. Send it to me. He sent it within the hour. I read it, made 3 specific revisions, tightening the definitions, moving the policy to the front section of the operational handbook rather than the appendix, adding a requirement that any proposed schedule changes affecting floor coverage be reviewed against the minimums before implementation, and sent it back. "These changes are significant," he said. "They're correct," I said. "The policy needs to be findable. If it lives in the appendix, it doesn't function as a policy. It functions as a record that the policy was written." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the argument I've been making for 7 months." "I know," I said. "Now we can make it together with the authority to implement it." He approved the revisions that afternoon. The updated policy went out to all Aldercroft Northern Region store managers the following week, accompanied by a brief note from me explaining what it was and why it existed. Not as a warning, as an explanation. People follow policies they understand more reliably than policies they are simply instructed to follow. I opened a new document and I started building. Back at Wyndham, the Q4 audit arrived in the first week of January. I was not present for it. I was no longer an employee. But I heard what happened piece by piece over the course of the following 2 weeks, because I had relationships with people who were present and who called me, not to debrief strategically, but because they trusted me and because what they had witnessed was significant enough that they needed to say it out loud to someone. The audit team pulled the November payroll records and mapped them against the Category A staffing requirements. They found what was there to find: 4 stores out of compliance for 6 weeks, entering the holiday season, with the compliance documentation clearly showing that the regional manager had been formally notified of the issue before the schedules were finalized and had implemented them anyway. The audit team pulled the November shrinkage data. It was up 14% across the district. At the 4 directly affected stores, it was up 22%. This was above the threshold that the compliance appendix identified as triggering a mandatory review. The audit team pulled the ethics hotline records. Gideon had filed in late November. 2 other store managers, Petra, who ran the Thornfield location, and a manager named Ferris, who ran the Parlow Street store, had filed independently in December. All 3 filings cited the staffing minimum violation. All 3 documented that they had raised the concern with regional management and received no corrective action. The audit report went to Patricia, not to Dorian, not to Isolda, directly to corporate operations. Gideon called me on a Friday afternoon. He was sitting in his car in the parking lot outside his store, which was where he went when he needed to talk about something that didn't belong inside the building. "Patricia's office called Dorian this morning," he said. "They're requesting a full incident report. There's a compliance review at the end of the month." "How is Dorian responding?" "He's cooperating fully," Gideon said. "No, I don't think he has a meaningful alternative." "No," I said, "he doesn't." They're also doing direct outreach to store managers. Me, Elena, Petra. Independent accounts of the past quarter. Corporate wants the view from the floor, not from regional. "Are you comfortable giving one?" "I already did. I told them the truth." A pause. "I told them about the email chain from November, the one where you flagged the compliance issue before the schedules went out. I told them I had the chain saved." "That's accurate." "I know it is." Another pause. "Mara, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Did you know this was going to happen? Not engineer it. Did you see it coming and position yourself accordingly?" I thought about the honest answer to that question for a moment. "So I didn't know it was going to happen exactly as it did," I said. "I knew that specific conditions produce specific outcomes in retail operations. I recognized the conditions." He was quiet. "And you documented everything before you left?" "I documented what was appropriate to document." A pause. "That's a very precise answer." "I'm a precise person," I said. He almost laughed. I could hear it at the edge of his exhale. He told me about Petra next. She had given her account to the corporate team that morning, he said. She had brought the documentation she had built in November. The vendor arrangement, the revenue data by time of day, the staffing case, and the corporate representative had apparently spent a long time with it. What she had documented was not a compliance violation. Instead, what she had documented was a manager doing the real work of the real job, work that was completely invisible to anyone who only looked at the surface numbers. They asked her who had suggested she document it that way. Gideon said, What did she say? She said it was her own professional practice. A pause. That is what she said. I didn't say anything. She also said, he continued, that the district had historically produced a lot of managers who understood documentation, and that she attributed that to the culture that had been built there. I looked out the window of the Aldercroft office at the parking structure across the street. Where are you, Mara? Actually, are you okay? I'm good, I said. I'm somewhere new. I'm building something worth building. Good, he said. And then, simply, good. Patricia was the kind of executive whose particular skill was reading situations quickly and acting before emotional attachments or institutional loyalties could slow her down. She had not arrived at her position through loyalty. She had arrived there through being correct more often than the people around her, and through being willing to act on her own correctness when it was uncomfortable. Isolde had been Dorian's choice. Patricia had approved it without close review, which was a different kind of responsibility from choosing it. But it was still responsibility, and Patricia was precise enough to understand that. The compliance review ran for 4 days at the end of January. I was not called to participate. I was a former employee who had left on professional terms. And the review was focused on actions taken by people who were still employed. But I heard the substance of what it found, through people who were in it and who trusted me with what they had seen. What the review found, Isolde had received a formal written notification of the staffing compliance issue on November 7th, 11 days before the schedules were implemented. The notification was detailed, cited specific policy sections, included a table of calculations, and was clear in its implication. She had acknowledged receipt. She had implemented the schedules anyway. The documentation of this sequence was complete and time-stamped. The staffing reduction had caused measurable, documentable harm. Shrinkage increase across the affected stores was above the mandatory review threshold. 3 ethics complaints had been filed. Customer satisfaction scores for December, which had compiled in mid-January, were down at the 4 affected stores, down in a period when district-wide traffic was up, which made the performance gap more visible, not less. The visual brand alignment initiative, the thing Isolde had spent her first 3 months on, had produced no measurable improvement in any tracked operational metric. On the 4th day of the review, Dorian was placed on a formal performance improvement plan. On the 5th day, which was technically the day after the review formally closed, Isolde's employment was terminated. I was sitting at my desk at Aldercroft when Elena's message came through. It was 1 sentence. I read it. I set my phone face down on the desk. And then I picked up the quarterly compliance framework I'd been building for 3 weeks, a document that had, as its first substantive section, a clearly stated staffing minimum policy with the calculations built in, located at the front of the operational handbook and not in an appendix. And I kept working. The store manager departures had started before the audit results. I want to be accurate about the sequence because the sequence is the part that tells you something true about how institutions work. Gideon gave notice on January 15th. He was clear with Dorian about his reason. He was not willing to manage a store in compliance conditions he had formally flagged and been ignored on. He gave 4 weeks. He was professional throughout. Elena gave notice on January 18th. I had told her on January 10th that I had a district role at Aldercroft available and that I would like to talk to her about it if she was interested. She said yes within 48 hours. By January 28th, when the audit findings were formally distributed to corporate, 7 store managers in the Northern District had given or indicated notice. By February 5th, when Isolde's termination became officially acknowledged internally, the number was 10. Of 12, the 2 who stayed were a manager who had been with Wyndham for 20 years and whose accumulated seniority was a genuine and legitimate asset she chose to protect, and a manager who was 6 months from a pension milestone that made any departure genuinely costly. I understood both decisions completely. They were rational and considered, and I respected them without reservation. The other 10 had made a different calculation. Several of them had been making it quietly since November, with no encouragement from me. The calculation was not about me. It was about what they had watched happen in their district over 3 months, about what it told them about the trajectory of the organization, and about what they understood their own professional standards to require of them. I was at Aldercroft Building. By February, I had 6 former Wyndham store managers in various roles, with several more in different stages of consideration. I had completed the first draft of the compliance framework and had presented it to Adrian, who had read it carefully and asked 2 specific and intelligent questions and approved it. I had also completed my first full tour of every Aldercroft location in the territory. Not a formal evaluation tour, just visits. The same unannounced drop-in practice I had maintained for 4 years. What I was looking for was the same thing I had always looked for, the gap between the official picture and the real one. At the Westmere location, I found it on a Wednesday morning in a conversation with the interim manager, a man named Oswin who had been running the store on rotation for 6 months and who had the specific kind of operational competence that comes from having had to figure things out without adequate support. He knew his store well. He had no institutional backing for the knowledge. The evening shift runs lean, he told me. We technically have the scheduled hours, but 2 of my regular evening associates have been quietly splitting time with a competitor down the street. They haven't told me directly, but I can see it in the availability gaps. Have you documented it? Informally. Formally, I said. Build a scheduling risk log. Every gap, every date, every associated coverage impact. Not as an HR matter, as an operational record. He looked at me with the expression of someone receiving a tool he had been trying to construct on his own. I didn't know there was a formal category for that. There isn't at Aldercroft yet, I said. We're going to build one, but you can start now with your own store. He did. The record he built over the following 3 weeks was the first template for what became the Aldercroft Northern Region Operational Risk Log, a document that lived in the front section of the Store Manager Handbook and that required a review cycle every 4 weeks. I tell this not because it was dramatic. It wasn't. Else it was the ordinary, incremental work of building an operational culture from inside out, finding the people who were already doing the right thing intuitively, giving them the formal structure to do it consistently, and then making that structure available to the people who needed to learn it. This was the work. This was the actual substance of what I spent my days doing. I had done it at Wyndham for 4 years. I was doing it again at Aldercroft. The specific institutional context was different. The work was the same. I had started the recruiting process for 2 permanent store manager roles that had been vacant or running on interims. One of them, the location that had been without a permanent manager for 6 months, was the most pressing. The interim arrangement was generating inconsistency that showed up in the numbers every month and that would continue to show up until the situation was resolved. Adrian told me in early February that the pace of talent coming from Wyndham was beyond what he had anticipated. We were in his office, which had a long meeting table instead of a desk, a choice that said something precise about his relationship to his own authority, and I had just told him that 3 more store managers had reached out in the past week. Is there a legal risk here? He asked. With Wyndham? I asked our attorney that question 2 weeks ago, I said. My employment contract at Wyndham didn't include a non-solicitation clause. I checked before I gave notice. Wyndham's standard district manager agreement doesn't include one, which I suspect reflects the fact that it wasn't considered necessary at that level. The people coming over are leaving voluntarily. No contracts are being violated. He nodded. I also kept records, I said. Every conversation in which a manager reached out to me first. Every exchange. The documentary record is clear about who initiated what. He looked at me for a moment. You prepared for this? I prepared for things to become complicated, I said. They turned out to be less complicated than they might have been. He picked up his pen and made a note. All right, let's talk about the Q1 targets. We talked about the Q1 targets. What I had built at Wyndham and then carried to Aldercroft was not, at its core, a set of processes or a compliance framework or an operational methodology. Those things were tools. The thing I had actually built over 4 years was trust. Trust is specific. It is built between specific people through specific interactions over specific time. It is not portable in the way that a set of processes is portable. You cannot document it and hand it off in a transition package. It lives in the people who hold it, and when those people leave, it goes with them. And the organization that remains has to start building it again from the beginning. Wyndham had placed my district under the authority of someone who did not understand this. Not because they were malicious, because they were looking at the org chart and the results spreadsheet and seeing those things as the full picture of what the district was. They were not the full picture. They were the visible layer, the visible, and the actual district, the one that functioned and produced those results, was built underneath, out of material that wasn't on any chart. The specific failure of the transition was not Isolde's lack of operational knowledge, although that was a real problem. The specific failure was the assumption that the district could absorb a leadership change without consequence, because the systems and the stores and the structures would continue to function as they had. The assumption that the people were interchangeable with the roles. They were not interchangeable. They never are. There is a concept in organizational management research called tacit knowledge, the knowledge that practitioners carry internally and can apply skillfully, but cannot fully articulate or transfer through formal documentation. The concept has been described and studied since at least the 1950s. It is widely understood in academic circles. It is consistently undervalued in practice because the things that can be documented and transferred feel more manageable than the things that can't. And manageable things get managed, while unmanageable things get quietly assumed away. I had understood this concept practically before I ever encountered the formal term for it. I had understood it from the first time I took over a failing store and realized that the things keeping it from working were not visible on the report. They were in the room, in the people and the routines they had developed around the gaps in the official system, in the institutional memory of what had been tried and why it had failed, owned in the knowledge of the things that technically violated the handbook but kept the operation functioning, in the trust between specific individuals that allowed problems to be surfaced honestly before they became disasters. All of it invisible on an org chart. All of it, in my district, attached to specific people who had been there long enough to carry it. When those people left, the knowledge left with them, not out of spite, just because that is where knowledge lives, in human beings, not in systems. I was in my car after a store visit when the call came through from an unrecognized number. The voicemail arrived a moment later. Her voice was measured and professional. She said she had heard I had moved to Aldercroft. She said she thought the situation in the Northern District had not been handled well and that she was prepared to take some responsibility for that. She said she would appreciate a conversation at my convenience. I played it twice. The phrase I kept returning to was some responsibility. It was a precise phrase, not vague, specific in what it admitted, and deliberate in what it declined to admit. Patricia was not a person who used imprecise language by accident. I called my personal attorney before I called Patricia back. I asked what I was obligated to do in response to a call from a former employer's executive in my current professional situation. She said, "Nothing." I called Patricia back 2 days later. The conversation was professional. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. I said of course not. She said she thought highly of what I had built in the Northern District. I said I appreciated that. She said she hoped I knew that Wyndham would always consider me a person of excellent professional standing. I said, that means a great deal. Neither of us said anything that was untrue. Neither of us said everything we were thinking. This is how certain professional conversations are conducted. Both parties understand it. No one is deceived. I thanked her for reaching out and ended the call. Aldercroft's Q1 numbers came out in the 3rd week of April. 6 of my district's locations had exceeded targets. 2 were on track. 2 were lagging, with specific and already identified structural reasons for the lag, and already initiated corrective measures in place. The lagging stores had plans. The plans were in motion. The trajectory was visible and positive. The 2 Aldercroft locations in geographic proximity to Wyndham's understaffed Northern District stores. Areas where, for a period of 3 months, Wyndham had been operating below minimum coverage during a high-traffic season, had both exceeded their Q1 projections. Some portion of that was foot traffic that had redistributed. I knew that. I did not design it. I was simply operating in the same market with adequately staffed stores and a functional compliance framework. And the market had responded accordingly. Westmere was one of the 6 exceeding targets. Oswin had accepted the permanent manager position and had already started adapting the scheduling risk log methodology to 2 other managers in his building cluster who had been struggling with the same drift without documentation problem he had experienced. He was doing this without being asked. I noted it and said nothing, because noting things and saying nothing is sometimes the most effective form of encouragement. Elena had already completed her first full quarter as a district manager. Her territory was smaller than mine, 6 locations, but the fundamentals she was building were correct. In her second week in the role, she had identified 2 stores running below the staffing minimums and had flagged them immediately. She had an email thread documenting the flagging, the response, and the corrective action. Knowing it was time-stamped and organized and left no ambiguity about what she had found and when she had found it, I read the thread one evening and felt something I wanted to name accurately, so that I am being honest about it. It wasn't satisfaction about what had happened at Wyndham. It wasn't the complicated pleasure of watching a bad decision come undone. It was something quieter and more operational than either of those things. It was the recognition that the thing I cared about, the actual work of managing a district well, of building compliance structures that protected both the business and the people who worked in it, of identifying what specific human beings were capable of and creating the conditions for them to do it. That thing was continuing. It was continuing here with these people in this organization, all in a form that was better than what I had been building before. I had built it the first time at Wyndham. It had been redirected by someone else's decision. So I had built it again, more completely. Somewhere that wanted it. That was not a victory narrative. It was just the truth of what had happened. Gideon stopped by my office in late April. The Aldercroft Regional Office was a converted warehouse space with exposed beams and industrial windows, and not quite enough natural light, which was something I had put in a facilities request about, and which I expected to be addressed on a timeline that I characterized internally as optimistic. It had a long communal table and too many chairs and a whiteboard that someone had filled with a territory map at some point and never fully erased. And he came with coffee from the cart down the street and no particular agenda, which was how he operated when he had something specific to say. He sat down across from me. "I heard something," he said. "That's generally true," I said. "About Wyndham, specifically the Northern District." He held his cup in both hands, the way he did when he was thinking. "They've brought in an outside consulting firm, an operational assessment, trying to understand what happened and why." I had not heard this specifically. I filed it. "That'll be expensive," I said. "Very." He looked at me with the flat, direct look that I associated with his most honest communications. "A preliminary report is apparently circulating." I heard from someone who heard from someone. "What does it say?" "The primary failure cited is the loss of institutional knowledge and management trust during the leadership transition. The specific language, as it was relayed to me, is that the district had a high concentration of operational knowledge in a small number of personnel who were not retained." I let that sit. "It also recommends," he continued, "that Wyndham develop formal systems for capturing and distributing institutional knowledge so that critical operational information is not dependent on any single individual's continued employment." I thought about the document I had opened the evening after the conference room announcement, the one I had spent 3 evenings building, not to give to anyone, but to understand precisely what I had and what I was sitting on. "Oh, they should," I said. "That's a reasonable recommendation." Gideon turned his cup slowly in his hands. "Did you document all of it before you left? All the things that weren't in any official system?" I looked at him. "I produced a complete transition document," I said. "Everything that was legitimately theirs to have was in it." He nodded, slowly. "And the rest?" "The rest wasn't theirs to keep." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah, that's right." He stood up, set his cup on the corner of my desk. "Q2 planning is Thursday. You still want to push it?" "Thursday's fine," I said. "We'll be ready." He picked up his cup. He left. I turned back to the quarterly review open on my screen.